Good afternoon. I'm sure you've seen the outrage sparked by the confirmation by government that ministers and deputy ministers don't pay for the electricity and water consumed at their official residences. Under the Ministerial handbook, ministers and deputy ministers, as I understand it, have two residences, one in Tshwane and one in Cape Town. It emerged this week that there's no cap on the amount that government will pay for these homes to use water and electricity. This comes at a time when Eskom wants to increase the price of power again, when government is already spending money protecting ministers from load shedding through the use of generators, and when the price of the electricity that you pay for has gone up by over 350% in the last 10 years. Well, earlier today, the Mineral Resources and Energy Minister, Mantashe, said it's untrue that ministers do not pay for electricity used in state-owned houses.
Ministers not paying for electricity is not true. You know, yesterday when they said that, I said they must invite people when there's load shedding to join me in the official residence here in Cape Town and have a lunch with me in darkness, okay? And we'll light candles and eat with you. So it's a story that is part of the negative narrative that is built, okay? No, we pay. It's not only pay for official residence. I think Minister Delil did give an explanation, okay, that if you have two residences, you foot the bill for one, the state foot the other one. But in addition to that, I pay for energy in my own properties, okay. Whether I'm a minister or not, my properties in Kala, I pay. The farm in Elliot, I pay. So this thing of treating ministers as some special population is actually not on, it's negativity.
Minister Mantashe speaking earlier. Angelo Fick is Director of Research at the AUWAL Socio-Economic Research Institute. He joins us now. Angelo, good afternoon to you. You would have heard Mantashe there saying that this idea of treating ministers differently is not correct. In a way, that may remind some people of the novel Animal Farm, written just after the Second World War, about a group of animals who take over a farmyard and claim that they're all equal to each other, but some are more equal than others. Does that seem to apply here in some way?
Well, not just on the question of ministerial parks and whether their amenities are paid for or not, the concession that amenities will be paid for in one house by the state and they will carry the cost in the other house. The question is not whether people do so voluntarily or whether they do so by matter of practice. The question is, what do the rules allow for, and should those rules be changed? And in that sense, while we live in a democracy at the de jure level, at the de facto level, we remain the most unequal society on earth, and we see this in the gap between what is considered to be acceptable for ordinary people to get by way of a social grant or by way of an old age pension, and what an individual minister or deputy minister might earn in a month. And so the inequality is not just at the symbolic level about who pays for which services. It is rife throughout the structure of the state and the relationship between the governed and the governing.
I mean, you make such a good point. I mean, people are told essentially to live on 350 Rand a month. I mean, that's probably less than 1 week's worth of, probably 2 days' worth of electricity in a ministerial house.
Well, yes, and I think for the moment we're fixating on electricity and water costs as basic services that ordinary South Africans are very distressed about, precisely because their services are interrupted so often, increasingly in Johannesburg, even water is interrupted, and people continue to have to pay as if those services are provided 24/7 for all days of the month. And so people are genuinely distressed and angry when they're told that the tax money that they contribute towards the fiscus, which is used to pay public servants and ministers, is being spent in this odd way that includes massive salaries as well as freebies by way of where they live. So it's not only already that they live rent-free in these official homes, that their usage of the amenities in these homes become part of what we have to pay for over and above already their salaries. We can imagine a very different kind of South Africa in which the entitlement of those elected to serve in public at the highest offices would be reflected very differently, and that may lead to a very different kind of society of equality that's flatter, that does not require of us to flatter those who serve us or say they serve us, and do not, rely on status, honorifics, and titles to the extent that we in South Africa have increasingly been required to treat those who say and speak as if they serve us, but in fact cost us an awful lot of money.
There's another thing here, because people in government keep claiming that people must pay for their services that they consume. The Deputy President, David Mabuza, said it many times, that there must be a culture of payment. The President, when he was speaking on the 25th of July this year, when he was making his emergency electricity comments about the changes, said that people must pay for the services that they use. And yet here we have people who are not paying for the services that they use. Is this a classic case of political doublespeak?
Well, it's not just doublespeak, it is the global way in which political elites govern. We've seen examples of this in the United Kingdom, where people who are members of parliament object to people claiming social support by way of universal credit, while at the same time claiming expenses on their second homes, on travel to and from work, in ways that ordinary citizens cannot. In South Africa, the vision that we have here is that those who govern us seem to feel, and many of their supporters seem to feel, that they're entitled to these perks in a society where the majority of people are not entitled to these perks. Now, whether or not one agrees with her politics, her political visions, her statements recently, when she was mayor of the city of Cape Town, Helen Zille took the Metro Rail from her home to her office and used public transport. This should have been an indication for all politicians in South Africa that they should be using public transport rather than blue light brigades. It should become the norm that ordinary people do have to be able to see, as Erin Motsoaledi did when he was Minister of Health, that he goes to the state hospital, not to the private hospital, or not out of the country for health care. That ordinary South Africans who have to send their children to state schools should be able to share those state schools with the children of politicians. The kind of flat society that is truly democratic would mean that those who serve in our legislatures and represent us should share the facilities that we do. They should live in our communities. They should be using the same transport that ordinary South Africans use, the same schools, the same hospitals, the same conditions of security or insecurity. And perhaps in that case, for ordinary South Africans, those conditions will change, because if ministers have to sit in the queues, deal with the discomfort of public transport and the delays and the poor services in our collapsed railway system for passenger transport, perhaps things would be very different. And we wouldn't have the situation that we had a few years ago, where the then Minister of Finance, or he had been the Minister of Finance prior to that, and had, his signature appeared on the notes, complained vociferously about not being allowed access to the VIP lounge at an airport, despite his status as a former minister. And so this kind of access to the elite benefits of a society of great inequality shouldn't pockmark our politicians' lives, because it really makes all their statements about being equal to us, being in the same boat as the rest of us, really, verge on the hypocritical.
There's a philosophical point, it's an important philosophical point that you've been making. Is there also an important impact on governance? And when we spoke to Kasatu Sizwe Pamla yesterday here on Newzroom Afrika Channel 405, he made the point that if you don't go and use bad government services, if you don't go to a government hospital, you don't know how bad it is. If your lights are always on, and we know that in official residences the lights are always on, because despite what Minister Mantashe may have said, there are generators which have been bought, and we've seen this confirmed through parliamentary questions. Generators were bought for some of these official homes of ministers and deputy ministers. Well, then you don't know what load shedding is really like, the sheer misery of freezing in a shack with young children in the middle of a high-felt winter. You don't know what that's like. So is there also a practical impact on governance? If you insulate the governing elite too much from society, they govern worse.
Well, yes. We've seen this at election time, when the current president of the Republic of South Africa sat for hours on a Metro Rail train in the north of Pretoria and was shocked and stunned that this was the everyday experience of thousands of South Africans on that line. So when we, I have a very middle-class life, and I have a great disconnect from the way in which majority of South Africans have to engage in their everyday lives. But I'm not governing and I'm not on a public salary. If people are going to be in public administration, if they're going to be governing, they should have a greater, shall we say, textured feel for how people experience life at the ordinary level. These, ministers, whether they're at the provincial level as MCs or at the national level as ministers, have a very different experience that's almost upper middle class and elite, given where they live, given how they live, given that their ability to rely on flights between cities, on official cars, their experience of inefficiency and efficiency in South Africa is very different from even middle class South Africans. So their vision of how peasant and working class South Africans have to engage, hospital services that are not in their villages, that aren't private, that are very costly, transport to and from home affairs departments or spaces where they have to get their social grants, insecurity in these spaces where they live. This is not something that if you're sitting in a ministerial compound, you have a clue at the textual level about. You may say that you've had memories. You may even say that you have family who live in these conditions. But if you are able to exempt yourself from that, there is much less incentive to fix that and to change that. And that's not unique to South Africa. That's a global phenomenon. And unfortunately, as Samir Amin, the Egyptian economist and political scientist, pointed out, in places like South Africa, the marginal periphery, those who govern often not in the interests of the people who vote for them, but often in the interests of the people who are going to employ them once they leave elected office. We've seen examples of this also in Spain. And so what we're likely to see is a much more, and we've seen this before, a much more, should we say, concerted response to complaints and objections from business lobbies, from, groups that are, feel that their profits are being cut into, and a much slower response to ordinary citizens' objections and demands. And so what we have to be aware of here is that if there is a massive gap of experience between those who are governed and those who govern, one, that isn't sustainable. We've seen it in other parts of the world. It leads to great political instability. Two, it really doesn't result in greater delivery of good services for everybody, because there are societies where whether you're a professor, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a cleaner at the airport, or whether you're a security person at the railway station, you're all taking the same train to work. You're all able to take a train from work. You can send your children to the same school. You use the same hospitals. In South Africa, that isn't the case. We've built, to quote Thabo Mbeki, two economies. We've built two societies side by side, one of great deprivation and one of luxurious joy. Railway lines that lead between the two largest cities, the capital and the economic heartland, one that doesn't function at all, and one that is a high-speed service that is so expensive that ordinary people can't use it on a regular basis. And so this idea that this is just we're all moaning about something that's negligible and silly. While this is horrific in other societies, it's tragic and actually untenable in a society like South Africa that keeps holding up, the politicians of this society keep holding up this vision of 1994 that we are moving towards equality. We're not moving towards equality when those who govern us live so very differently from those who are governed, the rest of us.
Angelo, in a way, it was ever thus. In other words, it's always been like this. And it seems to me, maybe I'm just getting old, but people have been complaining about the perks that ministers get for about 15 years. I think it was in 2009 when Jacob Zuma became president that through a series of parliamentary questions, I think from the Democratic Alliance, that we learned that every new cabinet minister coming in was getting a new German sedan in Cape Town and a new German sedan in Tshwane. I mean, an amazing story even now. And yet there's so much more anger this time around. Has something shifted in our society? Are we maybe poorer after the pandemic, whereas ministers aren't? Is it maybe because of the politics that the ANC could fall below 50%? Has something shifted that's made people angrier? Was it just the passage of time?
I think it's a combination of those factors, but also because increasingly more and more people in South Africa alive today were born in post-apartheid South Africa. And the promises held up to them year after year, election after election, every 5 years in 2 cycles of local and national elections, have failed to deliver. The unemployment rate is at a spectacular level. There's pauperization going on. People's experience of state services is not only that they're inefficient, but often that they're deeply violent and violating. And the lockdown revealed some of that spectacularly to the middle-class gaze, but working class and peasant people have always experienced this. The lack of services in rural areas, the fact that people have to, travel miles and miles to get to a clinic or a post office, these are all issues that ordinary, peasant and working class South Africa, the majority of people in this country, have been telling us about. We've had so-called service delivery protests in communities for as long as we've had post-apartheid South Africa. And what we see is spectacle. What we see from government in response to this is a kind of, attempting to placate people, and you can only do so many times. And increasingly, if people have no physical and sensual, embodied memory of living in an apartheid state, all they remember is their childhood from 1994, 95 onwards. They're 27 years old, the majority of South Africans, and younger, and their experience is a failure that isn't at the hands of former oppressors. Their experience of failure is at the hands of the people who speak in their names, who rely on them, and do not deliver. And so it isn't surprising to me. We've seen examples of this. And the ANC, I think, is very much aware, as are its deployees in government, that this one is not sustainable, that the instability in society will lead to greater and greater social and political instability of the kind that we saw in July of last year, and that we've seen in other societies across the continent. Let's not forget what happened in Tunisia, what happened in Mozambique, and what is currently happening in other parts of the world, where people who do not have that sense memory of what the liberation movement leaders who have been in power for a generation keep promising but don't deliver, they have a very different sense and a great impatience. And then add to that the economic collapses we have seen since 2008 with the financial crisis, then with the pandemic crisis, and now with the new crisis building. It's inevitable that the people who govern may have to look very carefully at how they, structure their lives, not just at the symbolic level, but at the material level, because known walls will keep those who are distressed away from the things that the people that they see as being responsible for that distress.
Angelo Fick, thank you. Really do appreciate the time. Director of Research at the AUWAL Socio-Economic Research Institute.